When it comes to grinding coffee beans, you have a lot of choice. I'm reviewing three methods: a $25 blade grinder, a $60 hand grinder, and a $600 single dose espresso grinder. I'm grinding beans with each one to find out if the more expensive grinders actually make a better tasting cup of coffee. Going into this, I thought these would be really easy to tell apart, but now looking at 3 cups of identical looking black coffee, I'm thinking this may be harder than I thought. So let's start things off with this blade grinder. This was $25 on Amazon and my first ever purchase for a coffee grinder. I'd actually say this is really easy to use, but quite difficult to master. Now the way this works is you just have this cup and there is a blade in here. The blade spins around and chops whatever it finds that gets in the way. And while it works great for coffee, it is really intended as an all-purpose tool to slice up anything. You can put a lot of nuts in here or whatever and chop them up. There are little measurement notches in here. The max is kind of important, but other than that, I would just kind of ignore that and make sure you measure out your coffee beans. So there's 15 grams of coffee beans here. That's a single serve of coffee for me. Now, this grinder can do some things that the more expensive grinders just cannot do. One of them is in terms of capacity. You can get enough beans in here to brew 9 cups of coffee. So you can fit 2.5 ounces of beans. And I'm not often brewing 9 cups of coffee all at once, unless I'm making cold brew coffee. And even though I have all of these other grinders, I still turn to this for cold brew coffee just because of its capacity. The other thing this can do that the others can't is I can throw it in the dishwasher. So cleanup is really, really easy. This just detaches straight out of here. Throw this cup in the dishwasher and it'll be fine. As for downsides, well, you don't have a lot of precision here. You can push down on this to spin the blades, but exactly what grind size are you getting? Probably very difficult to tell. So I'm not adjusting like anything on the bottom or anything like that to tell it how fine to grind. It's simply a case of these blades are going to spin around really, really fast, and I tell them when to stop. So that's the part that makes it difficult to master, because you need to figure out when the right time is to stop, because you think you've got about the right grind size. The other grinders I look at all have a way to dial in a very specific grind size. This one is entirely manually operated. I think the easiest way to figure that out so that it's somewhat repeatable is just to kind of time it. The number of pulses that you press down on. So let me show you an example of that. So we just click this in. It's in. Put the top on. And the way that now I turn this on is there's no switch, there's no power switch or no button to click. I'm simply going to push down on the top here. It's been grinding the beans. So just that one little pulse there, if I take this out, you can see that it has ground some of these beans up. Let's give it a few more pulses. And it started to chop things up now much more. And the second disadvantage is uniformity. This blade grinder does not do a good job of grinding all of the coffee beans to the same size, and that is super important with drinks like pour over coffee. The finer the grind size gets, the harder this gets to operate. So for coarsely ground stuff like cold brew, it works pretty well. Once you try to get down to a little bit finer grind for things like pour overs, then you're going to be pulsing quite a lot more. And then to get this to something like espresso, honestly, I don't think it would be possible. I think I could be pushing down on this forever and it would never get the beans ground fine enough for that. But let's take a look and see how consistent this grind size is. Yeah, I would say that's not bad. It's possibly a little bit coarse still for pour over, but close enough, I think. In terms of consistency, it's done a reasonable job. Not perfect, not perfectly consistent, but not awful. I've actually had this guy for years and I use it fairly frequently and just not been a problem. And even if it was a problem, $25 later, it'd be fixed because I could just get another one. Cleanup really is a huge advantage with this thing. I've just taken a brush and cleared it out, and there's really nowhere for these beans to hide here. I'm not going to get any stale leftovers. And yeah, this is dishwasher safe, but actually, to be honest, I don't think I've ever put this in the dishwasher. It's simply a case of just brushing this out. Takes a second, it's clean. Now, once I started to get a bit more serious about my coffee, I knew that I wanted a hand grinder like this guy, and it works completely manually. There's nothing to plug in here. You just turn it and that turns the burrs and that grinds the coffee. Now, some of the advantages about this is, firstly, you can dial in an exact size that you want. See on the bottom here, it does say fine and coarse. So you start this off at the finest setting. And the way that you do that is you take this handle here, that goes in here. And now I can turn this finer or coarser. And that's really important for consistency. So I know for most of my coffee beans, if I'm doing a pour over, 20 clicks on this is going to get me to the right size for the grind that I'm looking for. Now you can spend a lot of money on these things. This is on the cheaper end at $60, but I've had it for about a year and it's held up very well. For a while I was using this multiple times a day. I've had no problems with it. Very easy to maintain as well. There's not really an awful lot to clean. Just brush off the burrs between grind sessions and that's about it. Other advantages are, of course, well, because you don't plug anything in, it is completely portable. You can take this wherever. So camping trip, for example, not a problem. All right, so let's grind some coffee with this guy. I've measured out another 15 grams of coffee beans. Pour those in. I'm not sure what the capacity of this is, but it's nearly half full with 15 grams. So you could probably make 2 cups of coffee with this. That would be about it. But honestly, your grinding arm is going to have had enough at that point anyway. Okay, so to grind, put this on, turn the handle. The other thing I really like about it is just the tactile nature of this. So I can feel the beans that I'm grinding. When I grind finer, I can feel that it's more effort the finer that you grind. Honestly, it really is satisfying. Turn this thing. You can feel those coffee beans getting pulverized to just the right size. This feels like, oh yeah, this feels like 20 clicks. Oh, by the way, I think I found out the most efficient way to turn this handle as well. If you were to keep this still and crank this, it's a big radius you have to go around. But if you turn this in an opposite motion to this, then this basically stays in place and you're minimizing the amount of turning. Think that's easier? Downsides, there's a few. Firstly, there is not a huge capacity. Now you can get different sizes for this, but ultimately the amount of coffee you're going to get is going to fit in this thing here. So you're not going to get more than a few cups. So that's fine if I'm just making for myself or maybe for a couple of people. But if I'm grinding to make a big batch of cold brew, for example, this is completely a waste of time. You're going to be here for hours doing that. You know when it's done because instantly it stops making a noise. You feel absolutely no resistance. This thing can just spin on its own at this point, and that means that your coffee is ground. Now, the other big downside is the time that this takes. Now, how long it takes to crank the handle to get the coffee ground depends upon 2 factors. One is obviously how much coffee that you've put in here. For a typical pour over, I'll put 15 grams of coffee in. Then the second factor is how fine you're grinding. So for a pour over, I'm grinding at 20 clicks, which is sort of medium fine. And it takes me, I would say, 30 or 40 seconds of turning this handle to grind that much. Now there is a little bit of coffee grounds still around the edge here, so I'll get a brush and clean those off. But this is an example of how there are going to be some old grounds in this left over from the previous batch. It is pretty much impossible to get this thing completely clean without completely disassembling it. Now, how did this one do in terms of consistency and grind size? That looks really nice, really good size, very, very uniform. So with just a little bit of manual effort, 30 seconds on my part, which honestly I kind of enjoyed, I've got a very consistent grind. I didn't have to plug anything in. It's tiny, I can take it anywhere with me. So, I mean, there's really just no reason to buy ground coffee, pre-ground coffee, when you can take whole bean coffee put it through something like this and get that sort of consistent grind, and really you're going to get so much more freshness from this than the pre-ground stuff. And then there's this guy, the beautiful Niche Zero, and this really combines some of the advantages of both of those other two coffee grinders. It's electric, so it's just a case of flicking on a switch to turn it on, so no manual effort. That's nice. And it gives you a really consistent grind, much like the hand grinder. I mean, this thing just looks beautiful. I love the look of this. I think it comes in black as well, but the white, on point. There's actually so many things that I really like about this Niche Zero. For example, the way that you can dial in very easily exactly the grind size that you want. So I'm making a pour over coffee, and that means I'm going to want to set this to around 35. That's listed as filter or drip. And there's just a little notch here that I turn to get to that 35. I mean, that is such an easy way to adjust things. I'm not worrying about clicks. I'm not counting my pulses. I now know that I will get a very consistent grind, in this case for 35, to get the exact grind size that I want. And if I then want to change this back later to espresso, I just turn it the other way. And the other big thing with the Niche Zero is very little retention. So there's not going to be old coffee grinds stuck in this thing. Just in terms of design, the only thing I don't really like, it has a retractable power cord at the back. The power cord is really, really short. So when you're trying to put this on a counter and plug it into something, I find that I always have to use an extension because this thing doesn't pull out any further. There's not much to it. Now to dose this, you simply just pour the beans into the top here. But before I do that, there is a little trick to this that I find makes things much better in terms of reducing static. And when you're looking at grinders like this, static can be a big issue. It's why I had all of those bits of grind on the bottom of my hand grinder, is the static that was caused by that. So one way to get around that, just use a little bit of water. I've just got distilled water in here, just in a little spray nozzle. And I find that one spray of the beans, give it a shake to distribute it, that's enough to get rid of the static. So let's put the beans in, flick the lid down, and now the only thing that I need to do is I need to turn on this switch here and watch the magic happen. You know what it's done? Because it's not making any noise anymore. Turn that off. Yeah, beans have all disappeared. Everything is now into this cup. There are some downsides to the Niche Zero. Obviously, the first one is the price. This is a ridiculous amount of money to spend on something that chops up coffee beans. If you're just starting out, I wouldn't necessarily recommend going for this. Make sure you really care enough about coffee and you can really taste the difference in a consistently ground coffee over an inconsistently ground one to see if it's going to be worthwhile to you. It's also single dose. So again, if I was making a whole bunch of cold brew coffee and I have a big old batch to make, or I'm just making a lot of coffee for a lot of people, again, this is not really the best solution for you. You can't get that many coffee beans in the top here. Let's see how we did. A nice size for pour over. And I just think the grind consistency is fantastic on this thing. So consistent. In fact, let's compare this to the other two methods. This first one here, this is the blade grinder. You can see now, looking at this compared to the others, it definitely is the coarsest of all of these. And I really do have trouble with that blade grinder getting the beans to be ground fine enough. This one from the hand grinder looks great. And then the Niche Zero, this looks like it's been ground finest of all. Now that's all the theory, but really what counts is, does this make a difference in the taste? Let's find out. I'm going to be making all three coffees in exactly the same way. I'm using this Bodum pour over coffee maker, and I have water here heated to 205 Fahrenheit. So blade grinder, hand grinder, Niche Zero. Let's start with the blade. And that is a perfectly serviceable cup of coffee. Yeah, it's perfectly drinkable. I'm not really getting any off-putting bitter taste from this. At the same time though, I'm not really picking up on a lot of the notes of the coffee. The beans that I'm using typically do give just sort of slight notes of milk chocolate. I'm not really getting that, but I am getting quite a smooth cup. That's not bad. Okay, the hand grinder. Well, that's a good cup. That is a good cup of coffee. Just getting a lot more flavor from that. And I think that's simply a case that I've got more extraction out of the beans by the fact that I was able to consistently grind them, and also grind them a little finer than this. Now the Niche Zero, the single dose grinder, how does that fare? That is also a very nice cup of coffee. It's just a pleasant, smooth taste, absolutely zero bitterness, really pleasant. Okay, so the verdict. Can I tell them apart? Well, I haven't done a blind taste test, but I'm pretty confident I can tell this one apart from these two. This one is just less body, less flavor, decent cup of coffee, but nothing special. Could I tell the difference between these two though? No. To me, the hand grinder, the Niche Zero, these taste the same. Excellent cup of coffee both. Now, to make all three of these cups of coffee, I did use the Bodum pour over coffee maker. I have some tips for how to really get the most out of that, regardless of the grinder that you use. And to see those, check out this video here.